We begin this hour with yet another deadline missed in those historic nuclear talks with Iran. Negotiators in Vienna yesterday blowing through their deadline for a final deal for the third time now in 11 days. They are racing against the clock to meet their new deadline. That deadline just 2 days away.
We have a couple of different lines of discussion that are going on right now, but I think it's safe to say that we have made progress today. The atmosphere is very constructive. We still have a couple of very difficult issues, and we'll be sitting down to discuss those in the very near term.
In the extended quest for a landmark deal with Iran, John Kerry making some history of his own. He has now devoted more time to a single negotiation than any American official in more than 4 decades. But whether Kerry can deliver a nuclear deal with Iran is still very much an open question. Iranians publicly blaming the U.S. for the delay, while U.S. officials are saying the Iranians made new demands this week, calling for an end to an embargo on conventional arms. President Obama huddled with U.S. negotiators on Wednesday via video conference from the Situation Room. The night before, he told Senate Democrats that he put the odds of a deal at less than 50%. By missing yesterday's deadline, the Obama administration also missed the window for expedited congressional review of a final deal. Congress will now have 60 days. That is twice the amount of time they would have had if a deal was struck before now to approve any deal negotiators hammer out. That is yet another obstacle in the path to a final agreement. Joining us now for the latest from Vienna is NBC News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent Andrea Mitchell. Andrea, thanks for taking a few minutes this morning. So tell us, we have this new deadline 2 days away. What are the obstacles right now standing between these folks and a final deal?
Well, there's a lot of smaller issues that still have to be finessed or polished or honed, if you will, in the words of the Russian foreign minister the other day. But the big thing that emerged this week was Iran really raising the level of its demand for a lift of the embargo that has been in place. There have been 3 UN resolutions embargoing arms deliveries to or sales from Iran from 2006, 2007, 2009, from the UN Security Council. These resolutions would require a lifting of the embargo. The resolutions would have to be canceled. And Iran made that demand. These are non-nuclear issues. This is conventional weapons, but it includes ballistic missiles. And it was a real red line to the president, apparently, in that video conference call on Wednesday night. So whereas Iran thought with Russia and China's help, Russia in particular wants to sell arms to Iran and be able to get back into a very lucrative business there. With Russia's help, Iran was basically dividing the Security Council. It's the first time we've seen a real division among the negotiating partners here on what's called the P5+1, which is the Security Council permanent members plus Germany. And that created enormous strains. Vladimir Putin really exploited that in a previously scheduled summit, including Iran's President Rouhani on Thursday and Friday in Moscow. So there was a lot of tension back and forth, blame back and forth. And I think part of this was both the U.S. and Iran trying to show its critics, its hardliners, if you will, and I know they're not analogous, but the hardliners in Tehran that want to kill any deal, the critics of this, who include some prominent Democrats as well as a lot of Republicans and presidential candidates, Republican candidates, in both capitals who would like to kill the deal, even though they don't know all the details yet. But their read on the emerging deal has been very, very negative. And so each side, each negotiator is Zarif on one side, the foreign minister in Iran, and Secretary Kerry certainly want to show that they've been tough. They've gone past these deadlines. They've wrung the last bit of concessions out of their adversaries. Now the question is, can they come together? The best prognosis is that they might at the earliest tomorrow. Steve?
And Andrea, as we say, there's been so many delays in this whole process. This is another 2-day extension.
Absolutely.
If they don't come together tomorrow, is Monday a hard deadline, or is there just another extension after that?
I'm afraid to say it's just another extension after that, because if they believe they're making progress, they've been doing this now for 20 months. The feeling by the U.S. officials is that every time the Iranians go back to Tehran, the U.S. loses ground, because things that have been conceded to at the table are criticized back home, and they then have to revisit a lot of this stuff. The feeling by the Iranians is that every time John Kerry talks to people in Washington, they lose ground. So there are accusations of reneging on both sides. Just a clarification, by the way, on John Kerry's track record. This would be the longest time that a U.S. Secretary of State has been overseas on a single mission, but not compared to George Shultz, Jim Baker, or Henry Kissinger, who traveled all the time for, 30 days at a time, Kissinger's record. But that would be ricocheting around the world on different projects. This would be sitting in a foreign capital for 15 days is pretty extraordinary, and not devoting, real attention to the rest of the world.
All right,
it's a big commitment.
Andrea Mitchell in Vienna, keeping a close eye on those negotiations. Obviously, that story playing out this weekend. We will keep a close eye on it as well. Thank you, though, Andrea. Appreciate that. And joining me now is retired four-star U.S. General Wesley Clark. He was a former NATO Supreme Allied Commander and a one-time Democratic presidential candidate. General Clark, welcome. Well, General, first, I'm just curious, Andrea's report right there, this issue that's sort of emerged in the last few days about weapons sanctions, not nuclear sanctions, just weapons sanctions on a shipment of arms into and out of Iran. Iran wants those sanctions eased as part of this. They say, hey, look, those sanctions are in place because of the nuclear program. If we cut a deal in the nuclear program, those sanctions should no longer be in place. The Obama administration saying that's a red line. Do you think that's something that has the potential to, and that should potentially trip up a deal?
Well, I think it certainly has a potential to trip up the deal, but I think it's also a crucial mistake by Iran in the negotiations. And I'll tell you why, Steve, because the big challenge for the United States is to explain to the people and to the Congress why giving in to Iran's demand for nuclear energy and centrifuges and then releasing money back to them that was held in the sanctions is in the long-term interest of the United States, given the fact that Iran hasn't committed to change its conduct and is pursuing any number of military activities and other aggressive activity in the region. And it's a terrorist state. So by opening up this new avenue of talk on conventional arms transfers, Iran opens the door for the United States to come back with a new set of demands constraining Iran's behavior. I hope that we're doing that, because this is a much more constructive avenue of approach than simply a one-off trade on the nuclear technology.
I'm curious, though, what you think happens if this weekend results in no deal. And Andrea's saying probably if that happens, then this Monday deadline becomes a new deadline, maybe a couple days down the road. But if these negotiations eventually fail to produce some kind of an agreement, what is the way forward then?
I think it's continuing discussions on a new framework for an agreement. I think we're into a dialogue that's going to continue and continue and continue, because it's not just about nuclear weapons. It's about the future of the region. It's about terrorism. It's about conventional arms transfers. And behind that conventional arms transfer request by Iran, of course, it's very easy to see what's behind it. They not only want to develop a deterrent capacity with ballistic missiles that can strike the U.S. homeland or threaten to, but they also want improved air defenses so the United States doesn't have the military option. So I think they've made, as I say, a tactical mistake in bringing this into the dialogue. But I think that if there's a pause, if there's an adjournment, if there's a temporary failure, I think you're going to see continuing negotiations with Iran on a variety of issues. Iran is a nation. It's powerful. It's got a young, dynamic population. It wants its place in the region, and the United States is constraining that. We want Iran to behave responsibly in the region. And between those two sets of demands, that's the stuff of dialogue and, unfortunately, maybe conflict, more open conflict, if it's not resolved.
Well, and if there is a deal, of course, there's now the aspect of congressional opinion being offered that they would have 60 days. Congress has given themselves 60 days to weigh in on any deal that would be struck at this point. Given the resistance you've seen from so many in Congress already to the idea of negotiations with Iran, let alone any deal that's struck, what are the keys in your mind, President Obama being able to sell a deal to Iran? What are the key things he absolutely has to have in there to be able to sell this deal to Congress?
Well, I think it's not only to say to Congress, well, what's the alternative if we don't sign? I think he's already sort of rolled out the very heavy, penetrating bombs that would be the alternative conceptually if we didn't sign. I think he's got to be able to address Iran's behavior in the domain after there's a signature. In other words, Iran gets $100 billion. What do? Go on an arms buying splurge? Build a superhighway into Syria so they can roll columns of tanks in there and continue their conquest of the Middle East? What's going to happen? Congress doesn't want to endorse that, and neither does the president. So the president's got to come to terms with this issue in his explanation. It really is about Iran itself, not just about the nuclear discussion.
All right. Thanks, as always, to retired General Wesley Clark. Appreciate your thoughts this morning.
Thank you, Steve.